Okay, so yeah, this is a little bit of a long presentation, so I'm going to run through it pretty quickly. And yeah, so let me just fix my screen here. Okay, so this is a system dynamics model. It's really a systems thinking model rather than a system dynamics model. Systems thinking is a little different. It's a little less quantitative. Well, it's a lot less quantitative than system dynamics. But generally, lately I've been starting with systems thinking models and then converting them to system dynamics models. And I may well do that for this model as well. But this is right now, it's just the introduction to the model using a systems thinking perspective. So system dynamics for resilience against export controls of rare earths. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about there. So what I'm going to talk about today is in the preliminaries, I'm going to talk about the motivation, the purpose, the scope, and the analytical process. I'm going to talk about the process I use, the CLDs, and the key variables, the loops, reinforcing and balancing loops, the validation I did using a Japanese case study. So, and then I'll talk about leverage points, which are basically ways we can recover from this adversity. And I hope I'm going to get into the avoid, withstand, recover ideas there. And then I'll have some conclusions about what success looks like. So this is why this matters now. Obviously, everyone knows that rare earth supply is overwhelmingly China dependent, and China is weaponizing rare earth exports. And that's leading to disruptions that threaten EVs, wind, and electronics industries. However, we also know that Japan has also experienced this in the past, and they show that this risk is real and not hypothetical, and we can learn from what Japan did to try to respond to the export controls. Okay, so the purpose is to map how dependence translates into Chinese coercive leverage and capture the feedback between export controls and vulnerability, represent de-risking actions like diversification, stocks, and substitution, and show how information asymmetries and fragmentation can amplify risk. So the analytical process, I think this is interesting. I'm presenting this primarily to just not to be full disclosure, but also I think this will be very interesting for our discussion about AI for resilience, because this presentation was primarily driven by AI. So what I did is I had two articles. These were popular news articles from a journal called The Economist. And one was on the EU currently, and the other one was on Japan historically. So I uploaded those to ChatGPT, and I asked it for a CLD, a causal loop diagram. And so then I generated the causal loop diagram from the ChatGPT response, and I manually reviewed that, corrected the links and structure where it had made errors. So hopefully it's learning how to do this better. And then I used the ChatGPT to document the loops and to identify the leverage points with the verified structure. And then I uploaded the CLD documentation to ChatGPT and asked it to develop this presentation. So ChatGPT was used throughout this process. And if anything, I think it's helpful. It's a helpful tool. And I'm hoping that you might say, not discredit the presentation, but say, this was useful, and if Ivan could do it, then I could do it too, to help with resilience analysis. Okay, so the key variables are dependence on Chinese rare earths, Chinese strategic leverage on industrialized countries, de-risking actions, diversification, domestic capacity recycling, industrial-based manufacturing capacity, rare earth stockpiles, political coordination versus fragmentation, and information disclosure to Chinese authorities about supply chains. Here's the CLD that ChatGPT generated. It's really complex, and I don't expect you to read any of it. I'll go through each of the loops individually in the next few slides, but I just wanted to show you that that it is quite detailed, and I think as you hopefully you'll see it does make a lot of sense. So there's 4 balancing loops that gradually reduce the risk, and there's 3 reinforcing loops that escalate the vulnerability. And then the interactions explain why partial progress does not guarantee resilience. And then I use the Japanese trajectory to show the same competition between resilience and erosion loops. Okay, so the first loop is called de-risking and diversification, and it's a balancing loop. And the intent is that Chinese pressure should trigger diversification that reduces dependence and leverage over time. So the causal chain is that more export controls will lead to higher perceived vulnerability and stronger de-risking actions, and lower dependence because of de-risking, and then lower Chinese leverage, and then weaker incentive to use controls. So basically, loops start at one place and go through a system and come back to the place they started. So this is a balancing loop because more export controls leads to weaker incentive to use controls, which is basically trying to reach an equilibrium. So then the implication is that de-risking works, but is slow and partial. And we have some experience in Japan that can justify this conclusion, is that Japanese, after their export controls were put on by China, they shifted from 90% dependence to 60 to 70% Chinese dependence over more than a decade, which illustrates the time scale and the residual exposure. The next one is the stockpiling buffer. So the intent here is to build physical buffers so short-term disruptions do not immediately translate into industrial damage. The causal chain is that higher perceived vulnerability leads to higher stockpile targets, which leads to higher inventories and more stable industrial output during shocks, and therefore lower perceived vulnerability. Again, it's a balancing loop. Higher perceived vulnerability leads to lower perceived vulnerability. And the implication is that stockpiles act as a shock, not a path to independence. Sorry. And the validation is that Japan, they used buffers to turn this renewed embargo from a cliff edge event to a serious but survivable hit. Okay, the next balancing loop is called the industrial base protection loop. And the intent is to keep the manufacturing base strong enough to finance and implement de-risking. The causal chain is that higher perceived vulnerability leads to more industrial support and strategic investment, leads to a stronger industrial base, leads to greater capacity de-risk, leads to lower dependence and leverage, and leads to lower or less severe future disruptions, and obviously then less perceived vulnerability. And the idea is that protecting key plants early is essential. And the justification or the validation is that Japan's willingness to pay a significant cost premium for non-Chinese supply shows how a strong industrial base underwrites diversification. The next balancing loop is the substitution and efficiency loop. And the intent is that if we can reduce structural exposure by designing technologies that require less or no rare earth inputs. And the causal chain is that sustained vulnerability and high risk leads to more R&D on substitution and efficiency, leads to lower rare earth intensity per unit of output, leads to lower overall dependence, which leads to reduced leverage and perceived risk. And the implication is that this is a slow design cycle lever, but it is essential. And then the validation is that Japan's move toward rare earth lean components confirms that substitution is a long horizon but critical structural fix. Okay, now I'll get into the reinforcing loops that make things worse. And the first one is that this shows the intent of this loop is the information-powered chokehold is to show how licensing and regulatory processes can increase China's ability to apply precise and powerful pressure. And the causal chain is that more export controls and licenses leads to more detailed data on the supply chain and better identification of choke points and more effective and targeted controls, leading to higher Chinese leverage and leading to more incentive to refine controls and collect information. And then the implication is that uncontrolled information flows magnify coercive pressure. And the validation is that China's narrow 2010 restrictions on Japan illustrate how targeted controls can produce outside disruption. The next loop is fragmentation and slow response, another reinforcing loop. And the intent here is to capture how disjointed responses can prolong dependence on and strengthen Chinese bargaining position. And the causal chain is that higher Chinese leverage leads to greater political pressure and more national level uncoordinated deals, which leads to higher fragmentation and slower and weaker collective de-risking, therefore persistent high dependence and sustained leverage. And the implication is that fragmentation, that is between countries, lengthens the delays in all the balancing loops. And the validation is that Japan's comparatively coherent national response stands in contrast and demonstrates the value of unified action. Another reinforcing loop, I think this is the last one, is the industrial capacity erosion loop. And it shows how early shocks can permanently reduce our ability to escape dependence. The causal chain is that strong export controls reduced access to rare earths, and that caused production cuts and closures to sensitive sectors, and a weaker industrial base, less financial and technical capacity to de-risk, continued high dependence, and therefore sustained leverage and likelihood of further controls. And this is a classic vicious cycle, and the validation is that Japan's deliberate efforts to avoid permanent industrial loss highlight the importance of preventing closures if we want any realistic path out of dependence. Okay, so now we look at leverage points and where to intervene in the system. And I think it's fairly obvious that we want to strengthen and accelerate the balancing loops B1, B3, B4. That is structural de-risking, industrial support, and substitution. And we want to prevent R3 by preventing irreversible loss of critical manufacturing capacity. And we want to weaken R1 and R2 by managing information flows and improving international coordination. And we want to use B2, stockpiling, to buy time for structural measures to take effect. Okay, now we'll get into the avoid, withstand, and recover. So building resilience. In the avoid area, we want to reduce exposure to coercion, and we want to accelerate structural de-risking through diversified supply, allied refined capacity, and rare earth lean technology design. And this will strengthen information. We want to strengthen information governance to prevent China from acquiring detailed supply chain insights that enable targeted choke points. And then we want to reduce fragmentation by empowering an international authority to coordinate procurement, investments, and stockpile policy. The next one is withstand. So we want to absorb shocks without strategic concession. And we want to build strategic stockpiles size to maintain critical industrial output during multi-month disruptions. We want to protect key manufacturing capacities through conditional support, crisis credit facilities, and guaranteed access to critical inputs. And we want to harden supply chain nodes and introduce redundancy where a single point failure risk is high. Recover. We want to restore function post-disruption quickly and safely. We want to establish pre-authorized recovery protocols for rapid reallocation materials, cross-border industrial prioritization and emergency procurement. We want to accelerate and ramp up of domestic and allied refining, processing, and magnet production capability after shocks, and institutionalize lessons learned into permanent international resilience planning and technology roadmaps. So what would success look like? Well, we want to have a managed exposure rather than complete independence from China. And we want to lower the payoff for China from using export controls. And we want faster, coordinated, credible response capability. And we want structural decline in rare earth intensity across key value chains. And then, as I said, Japanese case was a validation of this work. They had a de-risking effort after 2010, and it reduced but did not eliminate the dependence on Chinese rare earths. They looked at alternative supply, which remains more expensive, confirming cost and competitiveness assumptions in the model. And they used stockpiles and diversification, which blunts the shocks rather than removing exposure. And the short-term leverage remains with China, validating the reinforcing coercion loops in the CLD. Okay, so conclusions. The vulnerability is structural and dynamically reinforced, not merely a function of import controls, import volumes. And then China can weaponize rare earths faster than we can de-risk without systemic intervention. And Japanese experience validates our model. Progress is slow, costly, and never complete. Resilience requires coordinated action that strengthens industrial capacity and redesigns technology itself. The goal is not zero independence, but reducing China's coercive payoff to near zero. Okay, that's my presentation. I guess Bill